for fiction in the archives. I don't remember the author.
Stoller and Stoller.
Forgetting history, that some things are better forgotten. And that's what we have tried to do in our schools in Africa for a long time. Slavery was just one of those things. Now it's over, you better get over it and do something else. I remember this saying from famous philosopher, if you forget history, you're bound to repeat it. And slavery for me was not one of these things. It affected our psychology, affected our economics and everything. So I think we should remember history. And part of history, of course, you're a historian and you want accuracy, but sometimes myth is important in building identity. Myth, not accuracy, but myth. Most of our original foundation stories are myths. They are not history in the, perhaps your sense of the word, you know. So I have a problem with that, and that we should. I know it is ambiguous. It can create problems. It can. But I think the usefulness of remembering this event in our history, in African history, Tanzanian history, West Africa, I think it's very important. And it is a pity that when we go through school, secondary school and so on, it's just a matter of not even a semester, 2 weeks about slavery. This is what's happening in Somalia. And so we forget a very important thing that shaped us, that made us who we are. And it's still, I tell my students, it's still affecting us, especially in our psychology. And so I'm not against being as accurate as possible, but forgetting it because we are afraid of the conflicts that it might cause, to me, it's a problem.
My question, does the slavery, because they're buying slave, also the missionaries, so does it affect the missions or the plan of those missionary institutions who came? So what is your opinion of this?
There is some principal difference between Anglican Protestant missions and the Catholic ones. We both were looking for constituency, and so the Protestant missions were trying to attract slaves, looking voluntarily to them. They did not spend money on finding slaves, but the Catholic missions did it. And the idea was to get children aged, say 2, 4, 5, when they were still at the state, they could influence them through teaching. For them, for the missionaries, they saw this as redemption, as a positive means. The numbers are not that high. We are talking the total number of slaves bought by Catholic.
Thank you. I like the way the perspective of problematizing, the perspective of not taking things for granted. I read it in your expose. And my problem is with the whole issue of memory and constructing a memory about something. I would love to get a sense in which we can get an authentic memory from a historian point of view. Otherwise, we might be always problematizing and maybe forget that at some point something happened and it was for real. It's not something that is just a manipulation by the writers or by the historians. Thank you.
And it refers the principle of non-retroactivity.
The problem.
And I don't know how much historians have been interested in that idea of trade in terms of slavery, to the extent, like, I think you mentioned it a bit, that it's tricky when we talk of the West African slavery, that there were kings, African kingdoms or whatever, who were actually trading slaves with whoever was buying them. So at the end of the day, then there's been this form of animosity, especially from African Americans, saying that in fact this whole idea of slavery is because of the kings who were selling us in that sense then. So I don't know how much, of what comment can you say about that, the understanding of slavery from West Africa as threat and hence fled to the Africa?
No, the initial historiography about this was basically slavery is the transatlantic slave trade is a white man's business. Okay? And then only then traveled around the world, the passports are taken away, they're complete dependence on their parents and so on and so on. Are they not slaves, female slaves? Our workers who are basically forced to work in this or other factory, even in China, or say in Angola, or wherever you want to go, are these people, their rights, or the lack of it, is that not very much akin to slavery? It's a social issue. My view is that when we reserve a sense of what slavery was like, i.e. the property of people, I could own you, you could own me, then we know at least we have a group of people who could be owned in some other sort of free. Okay? If we are operating with a very wide definition of slavery, then the term loses its precision, I think. So, while I fully support what you said about are there not many people living today in conditions who are very similar to slavery, and something should be done about it, I entirely agree. But at the same time, I have the feeling that if you are using the definition of slavery for these people, you might lose something of the sharpness of the definition. Okay? So there's this problem. How do you do justice to one end, but also do justice to the other issue? The first issue, what was it?
Just the impact of the study of memory or discourse of explained today. But I'm wondering in the sense that despite the fact that slavery was a thing which happened in the history of the Africans, but one thing that we are seeing as a current situation or as a real that come today is that actually slavery has taken different forms. I'm much aware that you are reading some of the current things which are happening in our country, like Kenya. We are seeing our women transforming into slavery or into slavery itself in Saudi Arabia. Okay, when we talk about the things to do with the aspect of education, the aspect of politics and economy, still actually we are victims of circumstances in the sense that actually we are still under the umbrella of slavery. I don't know how you can talk about it because actually we were victims of circumstances in the history, and today actually you can see what's happening. I don't know what's happening.
So here, another question here, right here, yes.
My question is from a psychological point of view. Having realized the way you have presented it, I've seen that slave trade and slavery in particular yielded to undesirable, I can say, consequences. Both of them, if we may try to look critically, we may associate them with maybe psychological, I can say, impacts. For instance, if one feels so that his parents or whatever were enslaved, to some extent can we ask some question to say that why is it my tribe were among those that were enslaved? And if one tries to reflect upon that kind of historical background, he may develop some sort of, I can say, inferiority kind of feeling. And my question is that having been someone who has worked in those areas that were affected by slavery, what has been done so far in order to help people to work on this aspect maybe of feeling inferiority, so to speak?
My voice is loud. Okay, my question is it right to come to the conclusion that slavery has been abolished completely in the Eastern Africa? Because nowadays we hear and even experience other issues like human trafficking, child labor, forced prostitution, among the others. And in these situations, it's like people are treated like slaves. So my question is it right to come to the conclusion that slavery has been abolished completely in the Eastern Africa?
Okay, let me respond. I earlier said that there are two ways of looking at slavery, in the narrow sense and in the wider sense. In the narrow sense,
You can see there are still a lot of questions and burning questions. my suggestion is that as we go down for some refreshments, we'll still have Dr. Deutsch with us, and please interact with him and do raise some of the disagreements or fresh questions that you have. I wish you could keep him for another 1 hour, but I'm afraid it is not possible. So I will be inviting, and please do stay for some refreshments. But before we do so, please join me to thank Dr. Deutsch. So please welcome downstairs the third floor to the Historical Institute for some refreshments.
Hakuna mwingine kama wewe, wewe Mungu Baba yangu, na kuinua na kuabudu, umetukuka twakuheshimu. Hakuna mwingine kama wewe, wewe Mungu Baba yangu, na kuinua na
So, most welcome to the Jesuit Historical Institute in Africa. If you just introduce yourself briefly.
My name is Jan-Georg Deutsch. I'm an associate professor for Common Life History in the University of Oxford.
Okay, that's great. And the topic you've given us is slavery and abolition in East Africa, from colonial fairy tales to the study of memory. Can you just briefly say what this is all about?
It is about two things. One is about the history of slavery in East Africa, but it's also about the way in which historians wrote about that history. And I noted that the colonial history and the early nationalist history had little to say about it, whereas the social historians of the 80s and the memory historians of the 90s might be more useful to shed some light on this issue. But the origins of all this is that in the history of slavery in Africa, perhaps the people who were most concerned with it, the slaves, have not given enough room for their agency. So what I attempt in my work is to show that they are not just merely victims of domination and repression, but there was a room of maneuver, what they could do, when they could use it. And that was what my research was about, the agency of slaves in history.
That's great. I think that explanation makes me ask another question about the state of the study of slavery and slave trade really in the academia. What would you say is the state at the moment? Is there great interest? Is there great research being done on that, great publications?
I think the research, if you like, the easy research has been done. The easy research is basically the one which is focusing on European documents in European languages. But Swahili sources, Arab sources have not been used to that extent because it takes special language abilities. I also think that the oral history has not been exhausted at all. I never got beyond the surface, just to see the lay of the landscape, but not really understanding how it is constructed. And so, to some extent, talking about memory is try to encourage people to see this as a valuable and lively issue in undertaking research.
Oh, great. Again, I'm led to asking another question. I guess most research is directed to areas of interest, and someone would easily ask, why study slavery and abolition of slavery at all? What would you say is the importance of this particular topic, especially to people in Africa, for example?
There's a great saying by an American author, I think his name is Faulkner. He said, the past is never dead, it is not even past. What he meant is that the past left a legacy which is defining our present. And in many ways, ideologically but also materially, we are still wrought with the effects of slave trading and imperialism. And then to understand the present, we need to understand the past. And of course, the old argument is, if you understand the past, you understand the future. So my interest in imperialism and colonialism on one hand and slavery on the other is an attempt to understand the present better. Slavery has affected different areas in Africa in different ways. In some areas the legacy is very thin and you have to dig very deep. In some areas it's a burning issue of the present. So it depends a little bit on what kind of societies we're talking about and what kind of slavery we are encountering in this. So it is an issue of the present, not just merely of the past.
I'm led to asking about sources. You mentioned that sources in Kiswahili and in Arabic has not been studied enough. And certainly I know from my own experience that mostly we read English sources written from the point of view of the British. And my question to you is, how about German sources? Do they exist and are they accessible?
No, I wish I could say I have exhausted the German sources and that's a definite study of the end of it, but it's not true. I know that there are other sources which one could explore. And I think the particular record of missionary societies might be a particularly good source for records on slavery. I mean, think about it that some of the Catholic missions were actually German missionary societies, but particularly also the Protestant domain. Those records have not been fully explored. And there's lots of work to be done in German sources on slavery in East Africa, particularly in the missionary field. Now, with the official archive, most of the stuff has been destroyed either by the German administration in Tanzania or during the Second World War. Missionary sources might be in Germany. It would be a good field for study.
Yeah. My last question to you is probably a kind of advice to us at the Historical Institute. The Jesuit Historical Institute is really founded to try and enable people in Africa, in this region of Africa, to access certain important sources in studying historical subjects. I wonder, from your point of view, what kind of material should we look for to collect and bring here and make them accessible to people, especially people at the level of a master's, trying to research, for example, the topic of slavery? What kind of records, what kind of books, what kind of material should we be looking for?
I mean, I firmly believe that historians are made in the archive. You cannot teach, you can teach master students that much, but I think one of the main parts of what you're doing is inducing people to undertake original and primary research. And that also means that you have to use the sources which are available, i.e. in the Kenya Archive, in the missionary societies, perhaps in Tanzania, particularly in the National Archive. And I think that might one avenue to explore further. What are the kind of sources which are readily available for people to study in official archives and in missionary archives? One other element of study would be to significantly reduce the cost of undertaking research abroad by more fully engage with what is available on the internet. It is amazing what the British, for instance, publish about their records, or the French. And for instance, all parliamentary papers are now published. And the trade slave records are, it's so huge that not a single person can actually work through in a lifetime through these records. So there might be some other records which are available through the internet, accessible to students at an institution like this they would like to study, because they're available now. They become more and more available. I would be surprised to see any more sources.
It's important that we don't read everything that was written then as gospel truth, and we read it with a critical mind. I think that's very important. And I appreciate the books that we sample as books that were heavily influenced by the colonial ideology.